We have Lab 10, so it's Introduction to the Muscular System. And it starts out with the terminology we see here, a couple of parts, an aponeurosis, tendon, and the retinacula. So we'll begin with those. The term aponeurosis is a broad tendinous sheath, and a great example is right here. It's called the rectus sheath, specifically this one. But this broad tendon covering the abdominal region, covering the rectus abdominis muscle. Whereas a typical tendon, you can see just the thin cords at the end of pretty much any muscle. So right here in the forearm is a good area, or down here at the cruce, you can see these tendons versus a broad aponeurosis. And that brings us to the next terms now, the retinacula. We'll view these here at the wrist. Notice here we have a textbook figure. So we notice this band right here. We're looking at the posterior side of the wrist, and that band is known as the extensor retinaculum. And as we turn it around to the ventral side, anterior view, we can see now the band here on the anterior side gets the distinction of a flexor retinaculum. Now just a closer look at a typical tendon. So now this next section is covering the motions. This is just a helpful section to go over the terminology, but we won't be directly tested on these terms. But you will see these terms as we move into the next lab. So I'll just quickly scroll over. Lab 11, where you see the actions. And you'll see this vocabulary here in the chart for the lab. So it's just helpful to know what they mean, and we'll go over these. So the first pair, flexion and extension. And we'll just go through the diagrams here. So we want to start in anatomical position, our reference point. And now when we flex a joint, that truly means that we're reducing the angle of that joint. So I have to imagine, of course, with your arm straight out, it's 180 degrees, the angle at your elbow. And when you flex a joint, you're reducing the angle at that joint. Whereas extension means to return to anatomical position. This diagram here shows a person extending beyond anatomical position, and the proper term for that would actually be hyperextension. Returning just to anatomical position is extension, and then if you keep going beyond that, that's hyperextension. So now the next terms, abduction, adduction, and we can see that here. So again, starting from anatomical position, and we see abduction, AB. You notice now moving out laterally. So moving the thigh, moving the arms, even the fingers, spreading them apart is abduction. And then returning to anatomical position, moving back medially, that's adduction, spelled ADD, adduction. So with these two actions, abduction, adduction, you're basically doing jumping jacks, that motion. Okay. Medial and lateral rotation. So this is now a twisting, and we can see that here. So you notice starting here at the shoulder point and rotating the arm towards the center, and another name for that is internal rotation or medial rotation. So twisting at the shoulder, the brachium, and rotating medially is medial rotation. And the opposite of that, rotating out laterally, externally, is lateral rotation. So this can be done at the shoulder, at the thigh. Whereas now supination, pronation, this is now specific to the elbow and wrist. So we notice here in this diagram, that the brachium is stationary, but now rotation of the elbow and wrist, rotating medially, that's the term pronation. And then rotating the elbow and wrist out laterally, that specific term is supination. The next few here, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, these are now seen at the ankle, at the heel. So we can use this figure right here. So again, anatomical position, the feet would be flat on the ground. Plantar flexion, you notice here that the heel is elevated, it's pointing the toe. That's plantar flexion. And the opposite of that, when the toes are elevated, that's the term dorsiflexion, seen here. Elevation and depression, so essentially the words for up and down. So we notice here with the mandible is a good example. When you elevate the mandible to close your mouth, and depressing the mandible, lowering it to open the mouth. Inversion, eversion, we're looking at the ankle once again. So of course, anatomical position, the foot would be centered, just straight down. So rotating the ankle medially, that's inversion. And rotating the ankle out laterally is eversion. Protraction and retraction. We can see that here as an example. So protraction to move forward. So in this case, it's like moving the head and neck forward for protraction. And retraction, pulling back. Or a better example, I would say, with your mandible, the lower jaw, if you protract the mandible, you give yourself a underbite. Or then you could pull it back, retract the mandible. And this last one, lateral flexion, this applies to the vertebrae, to the spine. This image here happens to show just the neck, but anywhere on the spine, tilting to the side, it's lateral. Lateral flexion, tilting to either side, anywhere on the spine, cervical, thoracic, lumbar. Okay, so again, those are just helpful in understanding the motions. And now we'll move into the histology. So we'll have a more detailed look at skeletal muscle, seeing a skeletal muscle cell, the cell membrane, the multiple nuclei, and the striations, both the dark band and the light band. So that'll take us here to the histology. And we could already see here, skeletal muscle cells are running vertically on this image. So we could just highlight one right here. That's skeletal muscle fiber. And we could, of course, see the sarcolemma. We just need to find just the edge of the cell, right where it meets the white space. So I'm just highlighting the sarcolemma right there at the border. You can see the multiple nuclei here stained in purple. So these purple ovals, you notice. So one cell has many nuclei along the length. The striations, if you look closely, and we'll zoom in, you can see now the stripes that go across the width of the cell. And to take a closer look, zoomed in here, you can see now the color difference of the dark band, the A band, the darker stripe, and flanked on either side, the lighter region, the I band. I is the light band, and A is the dark band. The next sample now is a motor end plate. We're seeing interaction between a neuron and the muscle cell. These first two terms, the axon, telodendria, that's from the nerve cell. The muscle fiber, of course, is a muscle cell. And the area where they come in close proximity, neuromuscular junction, where the neuron and the muscle cell meet. So that's the sample here. This is showing the motor end plate as a whole. And we'll begin here. The axon, you see this thick black portion. This would be the axon of a nerve cell. And now you notice how it starts to branch. Ultimately, we get to the point where we see these very thin, slender branches. And this is the term a telodendrion, a singular. And each single telodendrion leads to the bulb. And that bulb is now where we'll label the neuromuscular junction. And in turn, you can see the background, the stained cells that you see. These are now the muscle fibers. So in total, this motor end plate, we're seeing this single motor neuron, specifically its axon, and now it's branching to signal to multiple skeletal muscle cells. In lecture, we have the term motor unit, and that would be acceptable for this slide's title. A motor unit, the motor end plate is what we're viewing. And just a closer look here, we can see that telodendrion here, going to that neuromuscular junction. And now we have the muscle cell, and you can already start to see the striations as well. So that takes us through the majority of this lab 10. And at this point, the terms here on this page are just a lot of helpful hints and tips about the alternate names for muscles, the orientation and position of various muscles. So we'll go past that. And now lab 11, this is now the list of muscles for the axial muscular system, muscles that are connected to the skull, the neck, the rib cage. And we're starting here with the column, the names of the muscle. Learning the name and locations, of course, the first priority. And now, secondarily, you want to fill in what's known as origin, insertion, and action information. It's all written here in the chart. So when you just see a little star, that means you don't have to know that data point. And this is describing where the tendons connect to the muscle, the origin tendon versus the insertion tendon. And the action is the motion that that muscle performs. So to help you learn, of course, the section here with the names of the muscles, we have this file, the Lab 11 file, posted up for you. And it has the figures. You notice here the labeling of the muscles. And you have the answer key as well. So it'll alternate between where you could test yourself and then check the answers here. So as you're learning these muscles. And we have views of the head models and the eye models as well. So the first priority is learning the name and location of the muscle. And then secondarily, this is a good idea to make flashcards for origin, insertion, and action information, just to learn this here as well. And this would be a follow-up question for the exam. The first priority is you'll see a muscle labeled, and you want to name that muscle. And then a follow-up question could be one of these 3 points. Give the origin of the muscle labeled, give the insertion of the muscle labeled, or give the actions of the muscle labeled. And again, if there's a star, you don't have to fill in that data point. You would not be asked this information. So just the actions for these muscles here on the eye, and the same as you see down here.